Hey YouTube, I'm going to give you a video tutorial today on how to replace the front strut assemblies on your 2004 Mazda 3.
Jack the vehicle up using a heavy-duty hydraulic jack and then place an appropriate jack stand directly behind the front wheel on this little tab right here to support the vehicle. You'll need to do this on both sides of the car. Using a 21mm socket, remove both front wheels. So before we can begin doing any dismantling of any of the strut assembly itself, we need to make sure that we take our time to actually remove the items that are attached to this strut, specifically the ABS sensor connector here, as well as the brake caliper line, the CV axle retaining bolt, as well as the sway bar end link located here. And overall, to remove all these items is fairly straightforward. I mean, all we really need to do is disconnect this sensor cable here just by pushing down on this little tab on this connector and then pulling it away and then just putting it behind there. And then using a fairly large screwdriver, we're going to remove the brake line retainer clip located here. And it's quite stubborn because there's a lot of corrosion and what have you on this vehicle. But basically all you need to do is just kind of hook your screwdriver underneath it and then just work its way out by prying against the front plate of the brake line. And so when you get your screwdriver, you just gotta somewhat handle that clip right out, and it just comes out. And then how this brake line will be removed with a bracket is just give it a wiggle and pull it down until it pulls through, and you can sort of see the groove here. You pull down and slide this out. And then of course the most difficult step in this entire process is going to likely be removing this sway bar end link piece right here, and that's a 14mm nut. More often than not, salt and road corrosion will basically just eat away at the threads on this and then cause this piece to be very excruciatingly difficult to remove. Sometimes it's beginner's luck. You can use an impact gun and lots of penetrating oil to try to loosen that up. So what I'm going to do is that before I even remotely attempt to take this out, is I'm going to make sure that I spray plenty of WD-40 on this little nut assembly here. And then I'm going to come back in about 15-20 minutes after it's had some time to penetrate to see if I can use my 14mm impact socket to actually remove that piece there. So just not sure if you saw that, guys. Just bear with me. So yes, that nut is actually just located right here. You can't see in the video that well. Maybe if I slide this over, you'll be able to see it. But in a nutshell, there it is, right here. So let's hope to God that this comes out. And then the other thing that we want to do is apply plenty of penetrating oil to the joint where the strut goes into the steering knuckle right here, because how this knuckle works is it's a cast piece with a pinch bolt that goes through like such, and the strut goes through that bore. So if you can see, that pinch bolt will go through here, and then the strut goes here. And when you tighten this bolt, it's essentially pinching that strut to hold it into this knuckle. And what you want to do is that you want to lubricate it, well, undo this nut so that you can get a screwdriver in behind here, pry that a little bit wider, and then also lubricate this so that you can use a sledge or a dead blow hammer to hit on this main cast knuckle piece to pull the knuckle essentially off of this strut tower. So it's been about 15 minutes here, and I've been applying liberal amounts of penetrating oil to this nut. So let's see if I can remove this the first time around with an impact gun. So it's partially come off, which is a good sign. So what I'm going to do is that I'm just going to apply a little bit more penetrating lube here and then come back again in about 10 minutes. Worst case scenario here is that if this doesn't want to turn with your impact gun any further, you can actually find a exact fit Allen key, and it's metric, that you're going to shove into the center of this hex hole. Use a small screwdriver, by the way, to clean out all the sand and grit. Jam it in there, and then you can use a 14mm wrench to actually turn this nut. I'm not really sure why Mazda and Honda and all these other guys designed it that way. It would have been nice to just jam a wrench on the end and then use another wrench to just pull this off, but they had to use Allen keys. I'm not the engineer, I'm just the guy that fixes them. So you can see here what this looks like. And of course I can't get this to come out any further with my impact gun, so I'm just going to use a screwdriver here to clean out all the dirt inside this hole so I can fit the tightest fitting Allen key into this hole to hold this center core threaded assembly from spinning. And of course I'm going to flush it all out with WD-40 and see all that rust come out. And then I'm going to take a 14mm wrench, I'm going to place it like this, and then I'm going to take my 5mm hex socket and basically jam it into the end here to hold that, and then I'm going to see if I can start undoing it. So put this in one direction. So I'm not actually turning my ratchet, I'm actually using a ratcheting wrench here to undo the nut. And as you can tell, I've used so much penetrating lube that this nut is actually fairly easy to undo right now, which is a good sign, thank goodness. So we can pull that off, undo this nut here, and this little bracket comes off with it. And well, if you got this far, consider yourself lucky, because normally this is not an easy feat to remove these end links, especially when they're corroded. So you just push that out of the hole, and you just want to inspect the threads to make sure that there's no crazy stretching or corrosion, or to be quite honest with you, if these are as loose as the ones on this vehicle, you can always technically just go buy a new set and install them. But prior to reinstallation, just make sure that you put tons and tons and tons of anti-seize all over the nut and all over the thread, so that if you ever have to remove this again, that it's fairly easy to do so. Next step here is we're going to remove our little pinch bolt on the steering knuckle assembly, located just down in this region here. It is a 17mm long bolt, so we're going to use our impact gun to take that off next. We sprayed lots of lubricant onto this pinch bolt, and it's been about 15 minutes as well, so let's take this off. And it should just come off like that. Now when you remove this bolt, it's pretty critical to inspect it to make sure that the threads are not damaged or badly corroded. If they're really corroded, sometimes, to be quite honest with you folks, that it might be wise just to go to Mazda and buy a replacement bolt. If this ever gets all too rusted out or stretched out, and then you try to put it into this knuckle assembly again, you run the risk of stripping this, and then this knuckle assembly is a few $100s from Mazda, and it's not exactly the funnest thing to replace. In this particular case, my bolt's got lots of rust on it. I'm just going to use a Dremel and clean the living daylights out of these threads, and then coat the threads with ample amounts of anti-seize compound. So next step is going to be to remove the CV axle retaining bolt. Using your 13mm socket, let's remove the retaining bolt off the CV axle end. Again, whenever you're removing bolts, make sure you inspect them to see if there's any excessive corrosion. If you can try to clean it up, great. If not, when in doubt, go and replace these bolts. And the reason, by the way, guys, why I want to pull this off is that we want to have the ability for this knuckle to tip forward and move a little freely when we're pounding away at the knuckle assembly to loosen the strut off of the knuckle. Next step, apply lots of lubricant onto the strut to steering knuckle assembly, and then using as large of a screwdriver or pry bar as you possibly can find, try to reach in behind this assembly and begin to try to pry away to essentially widen the grip that the knuckle has, so that you can easier remove the strut as well as make the installation of the new one that much easier. So just take your time. You don't want to break your screwdrivers. Just work away at it, making sure that you don't pry inside the pinch bolt threads, because then you're going to end up stripping them potentially by bending the threads. Once you've tried to pry open this assembly as much as possible, you can always go and apply a little bit more penetrating lube just to make sure that things are free. And before we do anything else, some people I've seen made the mistake by unbolting this strut assembly from the top of the shock tower, and that's not how you're supposed to do it. You actually want to now begin taking a hammer such as this and begin hitting on these cast wings right here with some pretty solid, firm blows. And what you're trying to do is essentially you're just trying to pull that knuckle assembly off like this, off of the strut. So how we're going to do this is just start hitting, making sure that you don't hit the ABS sensor lines or the brake lines, because you can actually puncture things if you do that. So you want to alternate between the left wing and the right wing, and you can already see where the rust line is on the strut, that it's already beginning to move, which is a good sign. So you can even reach your hand up into underneath the strut, and you can even give this front knuckle assembly a wiggle as you're hitting it to loosen it up. Sometimes also helps to have a helper to help you push this assembly down. And in a nutshell, you see it come off at an angle, and you just give it a good push, a little bit of a wrestle, and now you freed the strut from the knuckle assembly. And so this is also why you want to undo the CV axle, so that this can come apart freely and not stretch the axle and pull all the bearings out of its cage. But also you make sure you want to pay attention here that you don't stretch this brake line. You know, that was a near miss here on my part, but you get the idea. Now, since you have this all out, it'd be wise right now to get a large pry bar and pry this gap open more. So this is what I was referring to. That'll make your life easier when you install your new struts, because strut diameters vary from manufacturing tolerances. So let's widen this up, taking extra careful care not to stretch any brake lines or anything like that of the sort. You don't need a lot. You just need to give it a good few nudges just to open up these jaws to aid the installation of the new strut. The last and final step is to undo the strut from the strut tower on the vehicle. Using your 14mm socket and impact gun, proceed to remove the 3 mounting bolts. If you have a bolt that's really tight and narrow, you can always use a 14mm wrench. Now, again, having an assistant to assist holding the strut assembly while you undo the last bolt is always useful, because these struts are quite heavy and you don't want to stretch these bolts. And then just gently remove the strut assembly from underneath the vehicle. And this is what the entire assembly looks like. It's worth mentioning that on top of the strut tower that there's this little spacer plate here. Just make sure that you take notice of the orientation of the holes located here on the left and the same one on the right, and how they match up with the 2 tabs here on top of the strut tower. But for the purposes of spring reinstallation, you can just leave that plate right there. Now this is what the strut assembly looks like once it's been removed from the vehicle, and as you can tell, it's fairly straightforward. It's just basically a long gigantic cartridge with a huge spring that's held in with the retainer plate, held in with a retainer nut on the top. Now I'm not sure if the shop really cares. I don't have the ability to remove the springs myself, so I'm going to pay a shop to do the work, but this is how the strut was facing when I removed them from the car. So I'm going to make a marking on the top of this plate that this is the actual front here, and I'm going to put an L here to indicate that this is the left side or driver side. The top piece is rubber, so you don't need to gouge it. Just make a marking on it so that if the shop asks, hey, which way is forward, you can tell them that this forward hole with this mark here is the hole facing the most forward section of the car. To remove the right side is essentially the same thing. Follow the exact same procedure. In total, this may have taken me maybe 30 minutes aside with me waiting around for the penetrating lube to loosen up everything. So guys, I had mentioned to you earlier that, you know, we have some guck and rust and stuff inside these threads here. So what we want to do is just maybe use like a drill to wire brush assembly like the one I've got here in my hands, and just using a wire brush, just do your best to try to clean out all that rust on these threads here. You might want to wear a dust mask. You know, breathing in rusty air I'm sure is not good, but that's all you got to do to clean up the threads on a screw. So this is basically what the bolt looks like after I've given it a quickie, 5-minute treatment on a wire brush attached to a drill, or for those that have a Dremel, you can use that. Either way, the whole premise of it is just to clean up all this crud on the bolt. Let's see if I can get you to focus this properly, guys. As you can see here, it's nice and clean. I inspected the threads ever so carefully. There's a couple nicks and burrs in there that I'll go over again with a wire brush. These threads need to be perfect. If there's even the slightest bump like this little one that you see here, that's going to potentially strip your threads on the knuckle. So once these are perfectly clean, I usually I wipe them down with a bit of WD-40 to make sure it's nice and lubricated, and then I'm going to coat this with a liberal amount of anti-seize before reinstalling it onto the knuckle. Now that everything's been removed from the vehicle, including the CV axle here being disconnected from the front steering knuckle, you can either leave it like this, as such, and just let this whole assembly sort of hang the way it is, or you can simply use a wire tie and sort of loop around this metal hook here into this knuckle, and then have this assembly be held together as such to take some strain off the brake line. But I found that if you tip it a certain way, this brake line is exactly the right length just to sit like this in a relaxed position until I can bring the new strut assemblies back from the mechanic shop that I'm going to be taking it to. But either way, you just don't want to stretch your line. That's the only reason why I'd do it. Otherwise, if you're like me, you can just leave it as such. So the next step is, since we're in here, I'd mentioned earlier that this end link piece here, can potentially corrode and rot out. My end links are actually a little bit loose. You can even feel it just by the way it's moving. I can actually feel that there's a little bit of play in this joint. So I'm going to use my same sort of ratchet assembly and wrench and lots of penetrating lube on the sway bar end of things, and I'm going to try my very best to undo this so that I can buy some new end links and put them on my car. So you got to be careful when you're undoing the end links here that you make sure that this inner hole piece is clean and that your hex head goes in nice and tight and firm and all the way in. If you strip the centerpiece, then you're basically going to be taking this end link piece out with a hacksaw by having to saw off this section. And believe me, I've done my fair share of these over the years, and it really sucks dealing with that. So a little bit of prep work by digging out all the junk in there, finding a hex key, metric hex key, 5mm, to jam right into there to make it fit nice and tight and deep, and then using lots of penetrating oil on the threads and using your 14 wrench to just slowly undo that nut. If you can even get a Dremel onto here with a wire brush to clean out all the corrosion on the threads that you're going to be going over, that'll make the removal process that much easier. So take your time, it'll save you a lot of aggravation in the future. So this is a little end link piece here on the sway bar side was a little tight, so I had to really manhandle this nut without this ratchet piece in, just to at least break it loose off of the sway bar surface itself. And now I'm just ever so carefully, with lots of penetrating oil, taking my time to remove this nut assembly here. Notice how much WD-40 I'm using and all the corrosion is coming off of this. So just take your time and it will come out. If it's badly rusted and you're stuck, then you're probably unfortunately going to have to go to a shop to get it cut out, or you're just going to have to crack out the good old handy hacksaw and spend half a day taking it out. When you buy a new end link piece, be aware that some of them may come with new nuts and some might not. I strongly advise that you ask in advance and make sure that you get new nuts with it, because everything is pretty badly corroded on this one. I consider myself... So this is what a replacement strut assembly looks like with the old spring put back onto it. And unfortunately I couldn't demonstrate how this was done because I didn't do it. I actually paid a shop here locally in town to compress my spring and remove the old strut and install them onto these new KYB XLG series strut. The reason why I chose these struts over the factory ones is because they're definitely a lot cheaper. They're Japanese made. KYB's been well known for making quality strut components. And of course they've also got a limited lifetime warranty. So if they ever develop a leak, say for the rest of the life of the vehicle, technically speaking, it would be covered under warranty. So let's put these back in. So the first step in how we're going to reinstall this strut is to remount it, at the very least, back into the strut tower assembly. And if you remember, when we had removed these, I told you guys to make a marking here to indicate which direction that this top plate should be facing. So I'm just going to simply reorient this strut back up into this area, and then at least reattach them with one screw loosely before I tighten everything down. So just ever so carefully, just realign all the screws that hold the strut assembly on, and just basically just need to hand tighten them for now. We want to have a little bit of ability to move the strut around just a little bit if we have to. So now the next step here is to make sure that the inside of this steering knuckle bore is nice and clean. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to apply a bunch of chassis grease to the inside of the bore, and the reason why is that it'll just make the installation process that much easier, because everything's just got a little bit more slip and give. Now, it isn't necessary, but from my past experiences it just makes sense to do it this way. To facilitate the install, what we're going to do is we're going to carefully push this arm down, this knuckle down, and orienting the CV axle back into the bore, and then just keep pushing until you get this piece to go in. Now, for the CV axle, you also want to make sure that when you're pushing things in that you're not inadvertently popping the CV joints out of the cage. And how you can tell is that when you push this, you know, it should move in and out nice and smooth, up and down, left and right. So in my case, everything seems to be good. So I'm just going to carefully wrestle my CV axle into the bore here and turning the disc until I can feel the splines engage, and then basically now I'm just going to finesse this strut into this assembly. So basically you can see now that it's aligned, and the next step is going to be I'm going to use a hydraulic jack underneath the assembly to raise it up so it pushes this knuckle up onto the strut. So this is what my hydraulic jack looks like underneath, directly below the lower ball joint, and I'm just going to begin jacking this knuckle up and then giving it a good wiggle, as well as some twists, because on the back of the strut there's a little tab that you need to sort of get into that knuckle assembly, and you're going to have to kind of raise and lower this jack and just sort of mess around the strut to turn it so that that little tab falls in between the knuckle clamps, so to speak. And in this case, it's going in nice and smooth. So now I can just give this a good wiggle to make sure everything's in, and then try to pass through my knuckle bolt, which is this, through to see if it lines up. And right now it hasn't quite aligned, so it means I have to continue raising this up a little bit further. Now the other thing I'm doing here is I've raised this enough on the lower ball joint now that there's all the pressure from the strut and spring is now pushing into this knuckle, and I'm just going to continue pushing it down as best as I can to get the strut to go on. And you can actually feel the position of the strut by placing your hand underneath where that knuckle is, and you can almost tell that the strut is completely seated based on how far down the strut is. So I've just got a little ways to go, and I should be done here shortly. This process can probably take as long as 15 to 20 minutes depending how patient you are. And you can continue tightening your jack, raising it up to keep applying more and more pressure to this knuckle against the strut assembly. Now, I had mentioned many times in our videos that, you know, whenever we're reinstalling hardware, especially suspension hardware, that we want to use some type of anti-seize compound, and the one I like using here is made by Permatex, and it's basically a gray material. I think that's derived from graphite. And what we're going to do is that we just want to liberally coat this entire bolt with tremendous amounts of anti-seize. You can never use too much on something like this because you have to remember how much salt and water and dirt is constantly being exposed to these fasteners. So the more you can cover it and protect it, the better chances you'll have next time if you ever have to remove them off of your vehicle. So I'm just going to thread this in, and I can actually feel it catching the threads nice and smoothly. And of course it gets a little bit tight, so I can just use a hammer and just gently tap it to align it. And instead of using my impact gun, I'm actually just going to use a hand ratchet and my 17mm socket to tighten this. And the reason why I want to do this is because I don't want to risk the potential for stripping the threads on that bolt. So the bolts are going in really smooth, meaning that I cleaned the threads properly and that the anti-seize is working correctly. And only near the very end here, when it begins to get tight, will I just simply take my 1/2-inch drive ratchet and just tighten it down as far as hand tight will allow me, plus a little bit more. And for those that are really worried about tightness, you could always just take your impact gun and just give it a quick bang off, and I do mean quick, just to give it a quick tightening such as this. And that's all you really need. So we've reinstalled that. The next step here is we want to reinstall this axle retaining bolt right here. And since there's no real corrosion on here, we're just going to simply take a whole bunch of our anti-seize and we're going to coat the threads in this manner, and it kind of looks a little haphazard and kind of messy, but as I said, you can never get enough of this stuff to put on. And so you just want to make sure that from the back side, the boots and what have you are not creased in any manner. Everything here from the back view at least is nice and smooth and symmetrical. There's no weird bulges or bends in the axle, meaning that it's probably lined up properly. And of course, if you look inside this, there's no dirt, corrosion or anything like that. And basically what we're just going to do here is we're going to hand screw this in. You don't ever want to use a gun initially to tighten it until you got at least 3/4 of it all the way in, and then you can take your 13mm impact socket to just drive that last little bit in until it just touches. So once it's contacts, you can just bang off a little bit more, and that's all you need. On the Mazdas, they use a 13mm fastener, so that just insinuates to me that you don't really need to torque it right down, like super tight. You don't want to, again, snap that bolt assembly in the axle, otherwise, well, you're probably going to have to replace an entire axle assembly, which can be quite pricey, and it's just more work than you need to do. So now that we've done that, we can now go ahead and slide our rubber hose for our brake line. Now to reinstall the brake line here, we're going to pay attention to this little groove here of where that sort of clip would slide into to retain this. Now sometimes what I find when you're reinstalling this onto an aftermarket strut and not the genuine Mazda one, that occasionally the little cutout here for the brake lines can be a little bit off. So what I have found helps is that if you take a pair of pliers and you just bend one side of that hole tab, that it makes installation a lot easier. So you can sort of see here that I'm going to slide the line into the hole and then up as such. And then, of course, if I need to bend this tab a little bit more to make more room, I can. And you can sort of see here that this is now going in. And then when it's inserted, you just simply need to re-bend the tab back up to hold everything into place. And now we're going to reinstall this clip assembly in the best manner that we can to hold everything together. So when you're installing this, you need to make sure that the clip goes into the grooves on that hose, and you can just use your little hammer here and just tap everything together, and that's all there is to it to reattach that brake line to the strut. So now that we've reinstalled the brake line and the strut assembly onto the steering knuckle, as well as the bolt retaining the axle, we want to reinstall the end links from the strut assembly down to the sway bar at the bottom here. So I'll just try to bring this in to give you a little better view of what I'm doing. Basically, the sway bar end links, you know, depending if yours are worn out or not, it doesn't really matter. I'm an advocate of saving myself a lot of headache, so I'm going to go ahead and replace these with new ones. And much like how I've put all the other fasteners onto this vehicle, I'm going to coat the living daylights out of these end link threads with some anti-seize compound to protect them from corrosion and to make sure that I don't strip any of the threads when I'm installing the nuts on them. Pass them through this strut assembly. Now, if you're finding your end links are a little bit too short, that's because you have to remember that you may have left your jack on the lower ball joint of your car. So make sure that if you find the length isn't right, double check to make sure you didn't actually leave this whole thing still jacked up. And then for the top, make sure you reinstall the sensor holder bracket. And then using some new nuts, proceed to replace the nuts onto the end of the links. Now, so this is what I do to tighten this down with the Allen key. So I'm going to use this Allen bit, it's a 5mm, to just hold this end link piece. I'm just going to use a wrench here to tighten this end link back down. And you're just going to use the same technique to do the opposite end of the end link that goes in the sway bar. Now these end links just need to be hand tight, they don't need to be torqued down to being super tight just because, well, they're just end links. And this is what that end looks like at the sway bar side here. So, much like how I did the top, I'm just going to simply hold this and then using a wrench in these tight quarters, I'm just going to try to tighten this down as best as I humanly can. So now, the last and final stage here in the reassembly process underneath the vehicle is to slide this ABS sensor cable into the holding grommet on this bracket and then plugging the ABS sensor connector back into the plug just directly behind this rotor assembly. So, as a quick recap here, we reinstalled this strut assembly. We've reinstalled this brake line. We made sure we gave everything a good shake. We made sure we inspected the brake lines to make sure there's no leak. We've also reinstalled the CV axle bolt. We've installed the sensor line, and of course, you know, we double checked to make sure that the CV axle doesn't have any weird bends or bulges in the boots. And in a nutshell, that's pretty much how you go ahead and replace this strut assembly. One more thing, don't forget to to torque down the top strut holding bolts on the shock tower as well with your 14mm socket and wrench. The shock tower bolts don't need to be insanely tight. Again, just hand tight is sufficient. They are only 14mm bolts. So the final step here, guys, is to reinstall the wheels and make sure that you use a calibrated torque wrench to tighten the 5 lug nuts in a crisscross pattern to at least 85 foot-pounds or to the manufacturer's spec. Take your vehicle for a test drive and then re-torque them again thereafter just to make sure that all the bolts are torqued down evenly. And then, so now all we have to do is raise the vehicle up and put the vehicle back down onto the ground.